She wasn't supposed to be there. No orders, no weapon, no assigned post. Just a sister who'd driven 4 hours through the Afghan dust to spend 3 days with her kid brother before his rotation ended. She had civilian clothes in her bag, a birthday card he hadn't opened yet, a tin of their mother's cookies wrapped in foil. That's all she was carrying when the first mortar round hit, when the second one landed inside the wire, when the radio operator went down and the gate collapsed and 40 armed fighters poured through the breach before anyone on base could blink. They didn't know who she was. Nobody did. She wasn't in the system, wasn't on the duty roster, wasn't supposed to matter. But here's what they also didn't know. The woman sitting in the base commander's guest quarters drinking bad coffee and waiting for her brother to finish his shift was Warrant Officer First Class Nadia Callum, former 1st Special Forces Group. 17 confirmed long-range engagements across 3 combat theaters. The kind of shooter whose file had been redacted so many times it barely existed anymore. And when the ambush began and the base started burning, she didn't run for cover. She ran for the armory. Before we show you the shot that changed everything, the one that turned 40 fighters into 12, the one that bought enough time for reinforcements to arrive, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Subscribe with the bell icon on. Because this isn't a story about a soldier doing her job. This is a story about what happens when the most dangerous person on the base is the one nobody thought to ask about. FOB Ridgemont sat at the edge of nothing. High Valley, Afghan highlands, the kind of altitude that made your lungs ache for the first week until they remembered how to work. The base had been established 18 months earlier on a ridge line that offered visibility in 3 directions. The 4th direction, the eastern ravine, was considered impassable. Too steep, too narrow, too obvious a death trap for any serious assault. That assumption was 18 months old, which meant it was 18 months wrong. Private First Class Danny Callum had been at Ridgemont for 6 of those months. 19 years old, logistics and communications, the kind of young soldier who joined because his sister had and he'd spent his whole life trying to close the distance between what she was and what he wanted to become. He was good at the job, steady, quiet, diligent. His NCO had cited him twice for attention to detail. His bunkmates liked him because he never complained about the food and always had batteries when somebody needed them. He hadn't told his unit that his sister was coming, not out of secrecy, just out of the private mathematics of pride. Nadia Callum was not someone you announced. She was someone who arrived, and you let people figure out the rest. She'd gotten the leave approved through channels that didn't require explanation, the kind of channels her previous service record opened without anyone asking questions. 3 days, no formal role, guest clearance. She would visit, eat terrible food with her brother, watch him sleep like the exhausted boy he still was under the uniform, and drive back to Kabul before his next rotation cycled in. That was the plan. The plan lasted until Tuesday evening at 21:14. The first sign was the dogs. Every base in the region had strays that lingered near the kitchen waste point, mangy and persistent and completely useless for anything except the one thing they were accidentally good at, noticing things before people did. At 21:09, every dog on the western edge of FOB Ridgemont went silent. Not scared silent, listening silent. The particular quiet of an animal that has detected something it doesn't have a word for. Corporal Ray Testa noticed it first, mostly because he'd been smoking near the waste point and the sudden absence of the dog's background whine felt like someone had pulled a plug from the night. He looked toward the eastern ravine, saw nothing, started to look away. The mortar round hit the motor pool 17 seconds later. Then the second one hit the communications center. Direct. The antenna array went sideways in a spray of sparks and twisted metal, and the radio operator inside, Specialist Wren, 22 years old from Lexington, Kentucky, went down with shrapnel in his right shoulder before he'd gotten a single transmission out. The gate didn't collapse dramatically. It went precisely. The outer barrier detonated at its weakest structural point, a breach that had clearly been planned by someone who'd studied the base layout with patience and purpose. And then they came through. 40 fighters. Maybe more. Moving fast, moving organized, using the chaos of the first 60 seconds like a key they'd cut in advance. Callum was in the communications tent when the first mortar hit. The blast threw him sideways against the equipment rack. He found his footing, found Wren on the floor, pressed his hand against the shrapnel wound with his palm, and screamed for a medic who wasn't coming fast enough. Outside, the base was already in triage mode. Personnel scrambling to defensive positions. NCOs issuing orders into a radio network that had just lost its primary node. And in the guest quarters on the northern edge of the compound, Nadia Callum felt the percussion of the first blast move through the ground beneath her boots and went completely still. Not frozen. Still. The way a predator goes still. She was at the window in 2 seconds. Processed what she saw in 5. Gate breach, organized assault, entry vector from the east. Personnel scattered and reactive. The defensive positions on the south wall were responding to a direction that wasn't the primary threat. She was out the door in 7. The armory was 140 meters from the guest quarters. Across open ground, with tracer fire starting to cut the air in stuttering red lines over the south wall. A rational person would have taken cover. A frightened person would have flattened against the nearest wall and waited. Nadia Callum ran in a low crouch, boots finding the ground with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd trained this specific movement until it existed below thought. She moved between the fuel depot and the supply containers, using their bulk as cover, angling north before cutting east, staying out of the sight lines she'd already mapped in her head during her first hour on base the day before. She always mapped sight lines. It was the same reason she sat with her back to walls in restaurants and knew where every exit was in any building she entered. It wasn't paranoia. It was professional habit, the kind that had kept her alive through 2 deployments in environments where inattention had permanent consequences. She reached the armory and found it locked. The duty armor specialist Graves was nowhere, had either taken cover or been hit in the first wave. The lock was a standard military padlock on a reinforced steel door, not designed to be defeated quickly without a key. But the ventilation panel on the eastern side of the armory was bolted, not welded, and Nadia had noticed that detail 20 hours ago when she'd walked the base perimeter with Danny, because he was proud of where he'd been assigned, and she was quietly cataloging every structural vulnerability out of a habit she couldn't turn off. She pulled a multi-tool from her vest pocket. She never traveled without one, ever, and went to work on the panel bolts. 3 minutes. The panel came free. She was inside in 4. What she needed was on the second rack. The M110 semi-automatic sniper system. Military grade. 7.62 NATO, 10-round magazine, mounted scope already calibrated for standard combat distances. Not her preferred configuration. She'd spent most of her career behind a different platform, in conditions where she had time to dial in her own data. But it was accurate, it was available, and right now those are the only 2 specifications that mattered. She loaded 3 magazines from the ammunition box, secured them, slung the rifle, grabbed a radio from the charging rack, tested the frequency, and climbed back out through the ventilation panel. 2 minutes and 40 seconds since she'd arrived at the armory. The thing about FOB Ridgemont's layout that the ambush planners hadn't fully accounted for, or had assessed and dismissed, was the water tower on the northwestern corner of the compound. 42 feet tall, steel frame, wide observation platform at the top used by maintenance crews and occasionally by junior soldiers who wanted to watch the sunset with a cup of coffee and pretend the war wasn't happening. It had a clear, unobstructed line of sight across the entire compound, the breached gate, and the eastern ravine where the assault had originated. Nadia Callum climbed it with the rifle slung across her back, moving hand over hand up the maintenance ladder, the metal vibrating faintly with the percussion of small arms fire below. By the time she reached the top, the assault was fully inside the wire. She could see the organized spread of fighters moving through the compound, using personnel structures for cover, pushing American defenders back toward the south wall in a compression maneuver that was going to box the base personnel into a single defensible pocket within the next 6 minutes. She pressed herself flat against the observation platform, unslung the rifle, and went to work. The first thing she did was key the radio. Not a call for help. Help was 20 minutes away at minimum, and 20 minutes was an eternity in a situation like this. She keyed it to reach whoever was running the base's interior defense. "This is Warrant Officer Callum, Northern Water Tower. I have eyes on the full assault vector. I need your defensive position commanders on this frequency right now." A pause, then a voice she didn't recognize, rough and compressed with the kind of tension that meant the person talking was making decisions in real time. Who is this? Someone on the water tower with a rifle and better visibility than anyone else on this base. "Who is your ranking defensive officer?" Another pause. Shorter. "Captain Olson. South Wall. Get him on." Captain Joel Olson had been in the Army for 11 years. 2 combat deployments, 1 training rotation, and 18 months at Ridgemont. He was competent. He was calm under pressure. But right now, in the first 4 minutes of the ambush, he was working with fragmented information and a defensive line that was being pushed back by an assault that had come from a direction his contingency plans had rated as secondary. His radio crackled with a voice he didn't recognize. Female, unhurried, precise. "Captain Olson, I'm on the water tower. I can see 31 fighters currently inside the wire. Your south wall is being flanked. There are 8 fighters moving through the supply annex on your left. They're going to hit your position from the rear in approximately 90 seconds. Redirect 2 fire teams to the annex entrance now." Olson processed the information in the space of a breath. "Who is this? Someone who can see what you can't. Call the redirect, Captain. You have 80 seconds. He called it, not because he trusted an unknown voice on the radio, because the voice described a threat vector that matched what he'd been half-sensing for the last 40 seconds and hadn't been able to confirm. He called it and moved 2 fire teams to the annex entrance. The 8 fighters who came through 30 seconds later walked into a wall of return fire instead of an unprotected rear. And that was the moment Joel Olson stopped questioning who was on the water tower. The science of long-range precision shooting is misunderstood by most people who haven't done it. It isn't about luck, and at the distances Nadia was working, 40 to 200 meters, it wasn't even primarily about skill in the conventional sense. It was about data management. Wind, angle, target movement, the geometry of the space between the muzzle and the destination. It was about processing a moving problem set and making sub-second decisions with an accuracy margin measured in fractions of an inch. Nadia Callum had been doing this since she was 23 years old. She'd been selected for sniper training because her spatial reasoning scores and assessment had flagged her as an outlier, and her instructors had spent 6 months turning an outlier into a weapon. She'd spent the subsequent 9 years sharpening that weapon on her own time. From the water tower, she began working the compound in sectors. Methodical, no wasted shots. Every round she fired had a purpose that extended beyond the immediate target, clearing a firing lane, redirecting fighter movement, buying a defensive position the seconds it needed to consolidate. She dropped a fighter who'd taken a covered position behind the fuel depot and had a clean angle on a group of soldiers pinned behind the motor pool. One shot, the firing stopped. She identified the assault communications node, a fighter hanging slightly back from the action, relaying coordination between groups, and removed him. The organized movement of the assault began to fracture within 40 seconds. The groups that had been operating with coordinated timing started making independent decisions. Independent decisions in a complex assault are the beginning of its collapse. She keyed the radio between shots. "Captain, Northeast Cluster, 6 fighters moving toward the armory. They're looking for weapons. Gate them into the open ground between the vehicle bay and the communication structure. They'll cross in front of the south wall. Your people will have clean angles." Olson copied. Repositioned. The 6 fighters were engaged in the open ground exactly as described. Another transmission. The ravine. There's a second wave staging in the ravine. I can see movement. 15, maybe 18 additional fighters. They'll come through in 5 minutes when they think the first wave has softened you up enough. You need to get personnel to the eastern perimeter before they arrive. Not to stop them, to channel them away from the command center. Push them toward the northern yard. We don't have the numbers for the eastern perimeter, Olsen said. You have enough for a deterrent line. It's not about stopping them, Captain. It's about where they go when they don't find easy passage. If they angle north, my position owns that ground. A pause. Then, copy. Danny Callum had gotten Wren to the medical point. The medic had the shoulder wound controlled. Danny had grabbed a rifle, reported to the nearest NCO, and been directed to a defensive position near the communication structure. He was doing his job, prone behind a concrete barrier, weapon up, watching his sector, when the voice on the radio cut through the channel-wide chatter. He knew that voice before she said her name. He'd known it for 19 years. Had heard it call him to dinner, argue with their mother, read his report cards aloud in the car with that quiet, amused tone that meant she was proud of him and didn't want to make it weird. Had heard it across bad phone connections from places she couldn't name, calling just to confirm she was still alive without actually saying it. He pressed his radio. Nadia, a beat. Then, maintain your position, Danny. Are you on the? Maintain your position. Eyes on your sector. He looked back at his sector. His hands were shaking. He didn't know whether from fear or from something that felt shamefully like relief. He steadied the rifle and kept his eyes front. 2 minutes later, a fighter who had flanked the communication structure and would have had a clean angle on Danny's position went down from a round that came from the water tower. Danny didn't see the shot. He heard the result. He understood what it meant. He pressed the radio one more time. I hear you, he said. Her voice came back flat and focused, and something else underneath that he'd only heard from her once before at their father's funeral when she'd been the one holding everyone else together. I know you do. Keep your head down. The second wave came from the ravine at the 19-minute mark. 17 fighters. Moving fast, banking on the chaos of the first wave having fractured the base's defensive coherence. They'd been listening to the assault radio traffic, or trying to, and what they'd been hearing for the past 10 minutes was a first wave that had stopped communicating cleanly, had lost its coordination node, and had been systematically pushed back toward the gate by a defense that was somehow holding better than it should have. What they hadn't been able to account for was why. They came through the eastern ravine and hit the deterrent line Olsen had set at the perimeter. 6 soldiers, aggressive positioning, enough fire to make entering the compound's eastern corridor feel expensive. The second wave angled north, which was exactly where Nadia needed them to go. The northern yard was open ground, 50 meters across, no substantial cover. She'd identified it during her perimeter walk with Danny. Had noted it the way she noted everything, quietly, specifically, without comment. Now she worked that ground from the water tower like she was conducting a class on the geometry of engagement. The first 4 rounds she fired were warning indicators, not into the group, but at the ground in front of their lead elements. Dirt and rock erupting at their feet. The group stopped, scattered, tried to identify the threat vector. Couldn't. The water tower was behind them, and the angle was wrong for their immediate visual assessment. They bunched. Not tightly, but enough. Compressed into a smaller decision-making space by a threat they couldn't locate. Olsen's redirected fire team hit them from the west as they were still trying to understand what was happening from the north. The second wave broke in 4 minutes. At 22:31, 1 hour and 17 minutes after the first mortar round hit the motor pool, FOB Ridgemont radioed Regional Command with a status update. Ambush repelled. Casualties, 3 wounded, none critical. Enemy casualties, 11 confirmed inside the wire. Additional estimated based on blood trail into the ravine. The base was still standing. Regional Command sent reinforcements anyway. 2 vehicles, a medical team, and a debriefing officer who arrived at 0200 and spent his first 20 minutes trying to reconstruct the defensive timeline from after-action accounts that all referenced the same thing. The water tower, the voice on the radio, the shots that had come from directions the fighters couldn't place, that had removed targets at moments that seemed to anticipate the assault's movements rather than react to them. Captain Olsen's account was the most specific. He listed the 7 tactical recommendations that had come from the water tower over the course of the engagement, each one with a timestamp he noted in his field log during the fight, because he was the kind of officer who wrote things down even when the ground was shaking. The debriefing officer read the list twice. "And you said this was a visiting civilian?" he asked. "Guest clearance," Olsen said. "She was visiting her brother." The debriefing officer set the list down on the table. "Do you know her background?" "She told me Warrant Officer First Class. Wouldn't say what unit." "Has she filed an after-action report?" Olsen shook his head. "She hasn't filed anything. I haven't seen her since the engagement ended." The birthday card was on Danny's bunk when he came off the final watch at 0400. Propped against his pillow, unopened, with his name on the front in her handwriting. Beneath it, the tin of their mother's cookies, still wrapped in foil with the bow she'd tied around it still intact. Tucked under the tin was a note. 3 lines. "You held your position. That's what matters. Happy birthday, kid." He sat on the edge of his bunk for a long time, holding the card. The base was quiet now, the kind of quiet that came after violence, heavier than ordinary silence, weighted with everything that had almost happened and hadn't. Down the row, Ren was sleeping with his arm in a sling, chest rising and falling with the deep unconsciousness of someone the body had decided to shut down for repairs. Danny set the card on his knee and looked at it. He hadn't seen her leave. Nobody had. She'd apparently turned the rifle back into the armory, resealed the ventilation panel with a multi-tool, and walked out through the main gate while the base was still processing what had just survived. The duty log showed her clearance tag scanning out at 23:04. 1 hour and 7 minutes after the ambush ended. No report, no debrief request, no commendation sought. Just gone. The way she always went, back to wherever her work took her, to the assignments and the missions and the redacted file with her name at the top that most people would never be cleared to read. Back to the version of service that happened in the spaces between what other people knew about. He opened the birthday card. On the inside, below the printed message, she'd written 4 more words in the same handwriting that had been on the outside. "I'm always nearby, Danny." He read it twice. Felt something in his throat that he didn't have a word for yet. The complicated emotion of loving someone who scared you with how far they were willing to go, who you needed to be safe and also needed to be exactly who they were because the world was better for it. He put the card on his locker shelf. Face out. Warrant Officer First Class Nadia Callum's transport vehicle reached Kabul at 0630. The drive had taken 4 hours and change, through terrain that required attention and roads that required patience. She'd driven with the window slightly open, cold mountain air running through the cab, staying awake the way she stayed awake on long missions. Not with caffeine or willpower, but with the specific focused attention of someone tracking everything around her and logging it in the background of her mind. She had a debrief in 2 days. Then a new assignment that she'd been briefed on in a 2-page document that was already memorized and destroyed. Then, eventually, another leave request for another visit to another base where Danny would be stationed. She'd figure out which one. She always did. At a small checkpoint outside Kabul, a young military policeman waved her through, then glanced in his rear view after she'd passed. Something about the way she drove, the way she looked at the checkpoint approach, like she was reading it rather than passing through it. Like she was already 3 steps ahead of wherever she was going. He shook his head. Couldn't place it. Let go. Captain Joel Olsen submitted his after-action report at 0800. It was thorough, accurate, and commended 14 personnel by name for actions during the ambush. The 7th person on that list was Warrant Officer First Class Nadia Callum. described as visiting personnel whose tactical guidance and precision fire support was instrumental in the successful defense of FOB Ridgemont. He included her clearance ID number, her guest registration timestamp, the radio frequency she'd used, and the precise time of her first transmission. He did not include the birthday card or the cookies or the brother she'd been there to visit. That wasn't his story to tell. What was his to tell was this. 40 fighters had come through a breach that was supposed to end with this base, either overrun or pinned into a corner until morning. And the thing that had stopped them wasn't the defensive posture or the perimeter walls or the months of preparation his team had put into their contingency plans. It was a woman with a rifle who'd gone looking for the highest ground she could find, in the dark, in the first 90 seconds of an assault, before anyone had asked her to, before anyone had even known she could. He submitted the report, requested the commendation be forwarded to whatever command on her file. He suspected it wouldn't go anywhere visible. He submitted it anyway. 2 weeks later, a new rotation of soldiers arrived at FOB Ridgemont for orientation. The base sergeant who ran the orientation walked them through the compound in the standard order: gate, motor pool, armory, communications, water tower. At the water tower, he stopped. A couple of the new arrivals looked up at the platform. One asked what it was used for. Maintenance, the sergeant said, then paused, and wants something else. He didn't elaborate, just kept walking. But 3 of the new arrivals exchanged looks that said they'd heard something, had caught the edge of a story in the pause before he moved on. Later, over dinner, they asked around. The account they got was incomplete, secondhand, missing details that nobody had officially confirmed. But the core of it was there. The ambush, the water tower, the voice on the radio that had been one step ahead of the assault for over an hour. The shots that had come from angles the fighters couldn't locate. The visiting sister, one of the new arrivals, a young woman from Georgia, sharp-eyed, 3 weeks from her first deployment, listened to the whole account without interrupting. When it was done, she was quiet for a moment. "What happened to her?" she asked. "Where'd she go?" The soldier who'd been telling the story shrugged. "Nobody knows. Cleared out before the debrief team even arrived. Left a birthday card for her brother and walked out the gate." The young woman from Georgia nodded slowly, said nothing else. But later alone, she thought about that. About a woman who'd driven 4 hours with a birthday card and a tin of cookies and walked into the middle of a crisis that wasn't hers and held the line anyway, quietly, precisely, without asking for credit or clearance or permission. She thought about what it meant to carry a skill like that, to have that capacity sitting inside you, invisible to everyone around you, waiting for the moment it was needed. She thought, what would I do in that moment? She didn't have an answer yet, but the question stayed with her, the way questions from good stories always do. And now we're asking you, if you'd been on that base, if you'd heard that voice on the radio, calm and certain in the middle of everything falling apart, if you'd found out later it was someone's visiting sister, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, who'd broken into the armory with a multi-tool and climbed 40 feet in the dark to take a position nobody assigned her, would you have believed it? Or would you have done what everyone did in the first 60 seconds of that engagement? Assumed that the most dangerous person on the base was someone you already knew about? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story reminded you that competence doesn't announce itself, that the people who genuinely earned their skill don't usually feel the need to tell you they have it, tap that like button, hit subscribe, and make sure the bell icon is on. Share this with someone who still thinks that dangerous means visible. Your next mission is already waiting on the screen. Go watch it. We'll see you tomorrow.